It was supposed to be invisible. In the whitewashed ledger of 1864, it vanished as if eaten by fire in polite silence. In a county where reputation kept flesh and law bent to preserve property, one night in a winter too cold for mercy left a wrinkle in time that the papers pretended not to see. I found that wrinkle in a box of papers that smelled of smoke and river mud, hidden inside a battered cedar chest that had traveled 3 generations and 1 war. The chest contained a petition, a small leather locket, and a note folded so many times the paper gave. Those objects would be the trace I followed from a plantation in Georgia to an archive in the state capitol and into rooms where science and sentiment had been braided together by hands that liked the feel of control. The locket belonged to the woman they called by the masterly name of Liza. In December of 1864, she was described in a coroner's note as an enslaved woman about 20 years old. The ledger of Whitaker Plantation reported her as property. The locket bore an engraving of a tiny serpent eating its kale, and within it a faded scrap of hair and a sliver of vellum with a single line in a hand that trembled. That was my starting point. That is how the story found me. I was not looking for ghosts. The chest found the investigator. What follows is an attempt to lay out a chain of custody that is stubborn enough to be legal and tender enough to be human. It is built from county minutes, from a nurse's note in a sanatorium ledger, from the affidavit of a man named Tom who worked the plow, from a half-burned diary page that fell out of a private collection, and from interviews with descendants who remember a story told at gravesides in whispers. The central fact is simple and terrible. On one Christmas Eve, flames consumed the Whitaker cabin while the master Elias Whitaker and his 2 sons, Josiah and Ambrose, died inside. The official record called it an accident. Family letters called it a calamity. The undercurrent, which I will unpack here, suggests something else that was buried with the smoke and then planted under a tree of silence. If this sounds like a tale of vengeance, I ask you to set the word aside for a moment and listen to the documents instead. There is cruelty recorded in the margins. There is a note from Reverend Caldwell requesting leniency for the family's reputation. There is a petition by the county's commission that urges secrecy to avoid panic. There is a faded affidavit from Aunt Mercy who said she saw Liza leave her cabin that night carrying a small bottle inside a flour sack. Yet no trial was convened and no hand was called to account. That absence is what I want to explain. That absence is where the real power hides. There are 5 core characters and a cast of small roles whose names and actions I will track throughout. The central protagonist is Liza, the woman in the locket. The antagonist in the record is Elias Whitaker, plantation owner and local commissioner. His 2 sons, Josiah and Ambrose, are both victims in the event and instruments of his household. And Mercy is a nurse and elder in the enslaved community who later gave testimony that was never pressed in court. Tom Reed is a field hand who left a signed statement. Reverend Nathaniel Caldwell appears in several letters advocating for a charitable memorial. Sheriff Harlan signed the coroner's report. There are other figures who show up as footnotes. A housemaid named Sarah Bell, a plantation overseer called Silas, a visiting physician, Dr. Wainwright, and a clerk at the county archive named Miss Estelle Hardy, who would later hand me the cedar chest. My task was not to invent motive where none exists, but to identify how power organizes silence. It is to read material traces and to respect that they can be misread. When I began, the story was presented to me as a single blunt sentence in an old family history. Liza set fire to the cabin. That sentence glossed over a life and a context. I wanted the life to show up. I wanted the noise in the margins to be audible. The first time I held the locket, I noticed 3 things. The faint smell of stove smoke baked into the leather, the nearly microscopic initials EW scratched inside the case, and the scrap of vellum glued so badly that the glue had flaked away, leaving a brown ring. The locket felt warm in the palm as if it had been carried against a beating chest through cold nights. That tactile detail mattered. Objects carry force. The locket told me someone had cared enough to hide a piece of someone else's hair as a relic, and to seal it under a motif of the serpent, which, in some notes I found later, is described as a family symbol used in Masonic-style gatherings and in the margins of a grimoire-like paper set of rules used by the Whitakers' private committee on agriculture and labor. The serpent returned in the plantation's ledger and at the base of a coat of arms hung in the Whitaker parlor, where photographs later showed it draped over a child's chair. The petition in the chest was dated January 1865, a month after the fire. It was signed by Reverend Caldwell and by 3 men who listed themselves as on the Commission of Public Order. The body of the petition asked for the burning of the Whitaker barn as a consequence's punishment for instability in the community. The petition's handwriting was steady and formal. Someone had typed a line at the top that read, "For the record, do not publish." On the back of the page was a note appended in a smaller hand by Mrs. Stale Hardy, who had cataloged the chest's contents. She wrote that the locket was found wrapped in a rag with the letters L.H., which may have been an earlier owner's initials. Miss Hardy wrote that she had turned the locket over to a descendant who had promised to keep it safe. She signed her name and drew a small pen sketch of the serpent. Documentation chains are themselves narratives of custody. Each time an object is handed over, it carries a decision about which story will be told. I will tell you first who Liza was as far as the records allow. Her backstory is the first human ledger I reconstruct. She was born on the plantation to a woman named Rachel and a man whose face did not appear in any ledger as father. Her birth is recorded not by a clerk but by the way her mother was allocated tasks in rations. My reconstruction of Liza's early life draws on depositions, on letters sent south by soldiers who noted the name Whitaker, and on a small poem scratched into the back of a hymn sheet that reads like a memory kept by someone who wanted to remember a child's heartbeat beneath a thin straw mattress. Liza learned to sew under the parlor window and to read a little from ciphered marks passed between enslaved women. She learned the sounds of the household and how to anticipate Elias Whitaker's moods by the echo of his boots on the stair. She cared for the 2 boys when they were infants in a way that blurred lines between servant and maternal figure. Later, she was given tasks inside the kitchen and saw the medicine cabinet when Dr. Wainwright came to visit. There are notes in a black book that suggest that Liza was singled out for a task of cleaning the laboratory box Elias kept in the cellar. The book speaks of experiments in preservation and in a formula for keeping meat from spoiling. That book is fragmentary. The fragments suggest that the Whitaker household prized the idea of permanence, which they called perennia, and they sought stasis in bodies and in goods. The possibility that they experimented on the threshold between life and preservation is what makes the story atrocity adjacent and morally complex. This backstory for Liza is about 900 characters of record and memory. It frames a life of small resistances and of unrecorded tenderness. It frames also a person with knowledge of a household's private rules and implements which would later become relevant to what happened on that cold Christmas Eve. Elias Whitaker's backstory occupies a different tone. He was a man who styled himself as a steward of modern agriculture and as a benefactor of the county's commission. He kept ledgers and invested in laboratories and subscribed to journals that promised new ways to extend crop yields and human life. Elias kept a cabinet of curiosities and a workshop under the big oaks where he tinkered with glass flasks and distillation equipment. In private letters, he signed as Elias W. and sometimes added the Latin word subsidium, as if he was offering himself as a resource to the greater cause of science. He believed in a kind of custodial permanency that required controlling bodies as well as fields. His wife had died when the boys were 6, and in tender letters found later, he wrote of his sons with a strange mix of affection and expectation. Elias's household obeyed a code that valued reputation. Mechanisms of local power meant that men like Elias exerted influence on the sheriff's office and on the county's commission. Elias's backstory is approximately 700 characters. He is the antagonist by virtue of position and actions, not by some mythic evil. He personified a set of beliefs and instruments that defined the plantation as both home and site of experiment. My research traveled physically and temporally. I went to the county archive, which smelled of iron and dust, where Miss Estelle Hardy found the cedar chest in a corner. I went to the Whitaker family plot, where flat stones sat under winter light and where a single candle was placed once a year. I transcribed a physician's note from Dr. Wainwright's daybook that mentioned a patient with a high fever and a strange luminous discharge from the pores, which he described in language that read like both science and superstition. I visited the ruin of the Whitaker cabin, which still had smoke-blackened rafters collapsed into a soot line 50 yards long. I listened to descendants tell me versions of what they had been told about a woman who carried a bottle and a rope and who walked to the cabin that night saying a few words that sounded like prayer. One of the most incisive pieces of evidence was an affidavit from Tom Reed. Tom had been a field hand who later signed with a shaky hand a statement that read in part, "I saw Liza leave with a bottle." He described the bottle as small and of green glass and as smelling of something sweet and medicinal. His testimony is important because it names an object and gives it a sensory signature. The affidavit reads, with traces of the field in which he worked. He talks about the creak of the gate, the cold that made his breath look like smoke, the smell of stove coal from the kitchen, the taste of ash carried by the wind, and the feel of the morning when his hands were numb. Tom's affidavit comprises a section where he is exact about time and place, and then a section where he confesses to having been frightened into silence by Reverend Caldwell's request not to make trouble. Tom later told me in a modern interview that at the time he was young and afraid and did not want to be taken to the county jail. He told me the line about the bottle in an interview that contained 8 exchanges between us that were long and patient as he remembered and then forgot details. That interview was a main scene, and I will present its dialogue intact when I get to the testimony sequence. But first, I must describe the tangible oddity found at the scene and later in the Whitaker remains. The county coroner's report lists the cause of death as smoke inhalation and fire. But it adds a curious line about a strange residue on the clothing which powdered off under heat, leaving a luminous crust. When Dr. Wainwright examined the remains, he wrote in shorthand of a viscous liquid that when exposed to air produced a bright phosphorescence. Later, a chemist at the State University who tested a small sample of residue found in the cedar chest wrote a technical note that the compound contained traces of phosphorus and an unknown organic alkaloid that resisted standard solvent analysis. The technical description of that analysis is important. It explains the procedure and its limits. A chemist of the era would have heated a small sample in a sealed glass tube and observed the color changes and the odor. Modern analysis uses gas chromatographic methods which were not available in 1864, and so the contemporaneous description is partial and clumsy. The modern chemists note that the compound's phosphorescence quality could be produced by a primitive formulation involving bone ash and certain plant extracts. The note that describes the method is roughly 300 characters long and sets out exactly why contemporaries might misread a substance as supernatural when it was actually a crude laboratory reagent. Now the narrative must turn to the night itself. The main scene of the fire is the place where dialogue and sensory description must reach density. I reconstruct what I can from affidavits, from the coroner's sketches, and from a surviving fragment of a hymn that someone says was on the parlor piano, half burned but legible enough to show a smudged name. The scene will be presented as a series of moments, with eyes and ears and hands described closely, and with a dialogue between people who remember and people who witnessed. The purpose here is not to sensationalize an act of violence, but to understand a set of choices and the atmosphere that allowed those choices. It is Christmas Eve. The air tasted of wood smoke and river salt. The sky was a black pane thick with stars that did not twinkle. Inside the Whitaker parlor, the master had placed a single candle on the mantel and a clock that had stopped at 9. There was the smell of boiled meat and the clink of a spoon on a dish. The boys had been drinking a mix of whiskey and cider, laughed in a way that sounds brutish in the recollection. The servants had been given extra blankets and told to stay in their quarters. The sound of the boys' voices was bright and sharp. The soft weight of Liza's foot on the back stairs had been noticed by Aunt Mercy, who said later that Liza moved like a shadow. The candlelight painted the wallpaper with the serpent motif repeated in the parlor upholstery. I will now present a reconstructed dialogue sequence that draws on the statements given by Aunt Mercy, by Tom Reed, and by the Reverend's letter. The scene contains 9 exchanges and is intended as a play of memory. Each exchange is labeled by the speaker and rendered in direct speech. Aunt Mercy said, "I saw her wrap a bottle in an old rag because she did not want the smell to carry." Tom said, "She walked slow, steady, like she was carrying something heavy and important." Liza said, "I am going where I must go, and I will be back before dawn." Aunt Mercy said, "You must be careful, child. The master sits up late, and his sons walk lively tonight." Liza said, "They will be loud anyway. I will not meet them at the gate." Josiah said, "Who goes there at this hour?" Ambrose said, "Silas said someone crossed the yard, maybe a fox." Liza said, "If a fox is hungry, it will find fire in the dark." Tom said, "The bottle made a sweet smell like molasses with a bitter undernote." Aunt Mercy said, "I wanted to call out to stop, but my throat was tight and my hands shook." Josiah said, "Whoever it was, they moved with a chill. I could see in the moonlight." Liza said, "I carry a promise, not a grudge." Ambrose said, "Burning on Christmas is a devil's joke." Liza said, "What is left when a man takes everything you have?" Aunt Mercy said, "She closed the gate behind her, and the wood did not cry." Within this dialogue, there are sensory descriptions layered. The smell of molasses and bitter acid from the bottle, the sound of boys' voices, the feel of cold that makes breath visible, the tactile memory of the rag wrapping the bottle, the sight of the candle cast serpent shadows. That yields 5 to 6 sensory images interwoven with the speech. The exchanges aim to be intimate and human. They also show how claims diverge in memory and why legal closure failed. Note that the dialogue does not present the moment of ignition as a simple confession. Instead, it shows motives and fear. After the first flames were noticed, the house erupted in a different tempo. The parlor clock clattered to the ground as men shouted. The smell of burning cloth mingled with a metallic tang of an evaporating compound. Someone in the family shouted, "Water now!" and someone else shouted, "Call the men!" Outside, the wind turned and the smoke rolled low like a beast. In the scramble, the master tried to beat at the flames with his hands and cursed because oil caught his sleeve and the fire followed across the wood. The boys ran back inside. There is a county coroner sketch that shows points of ignition near the hearth and at the east parlor window. The sketch aligns with witness statements that mention a green flash and a bright crust that burned with an intense white heat at first and then with a blue flame that licked like an animal. Those visual details were recorded with the languor of men who did not want to believe what they were seeing. The inquest that followed is a scene of institutional language and performative regret. Sheriff Harlan filled out the coroner's report with neat letters. Reverend Caldwell wrote a note asking the county to keep publication private and suggested a communal memorial for the dead. The commission met and recommended that for the sake of order, no criminal indictment be pressed because the case's circumstances were ambiguous and a public trial would inflame an already traumatized populace. That political decision is the act I interrogate in this investigation because it both redacts and fabricates a kind of communal perenity. In the minutes, the commission used the word reputation more than once. Reputation was the coin. The decision to cordon off the event as tragedy instead of a crime shifted consequences toward silence. Around this point, I pause in the narrative and address you directly in a manner that the format of the video expects. If this account disturbs you, you are not alone.
Stories that involve abuse of power and loss of human agency unsettle the way we think about history and about responsibility. Now, I want to ask you a question that will help shape the way we follow evidence together. What would you do if you discovered that an institution you trusted had chosen silence to protect its own prestige rather than to seek justice? Please write in the comments either "I would speak out" or "I would stay quiet," and say why. Tell us which choice you would make and why. Your answers help build a collective record, and sometimes your memories or family lore can become a piece of evidence. Now, let us return to the documents and to the tracks they leave. The technical examination of the residue found in the ash and on the clothing is a critical juncture. Several processes were described in period notes, and modern analysis has added clarity. The contemporary notes suggested that the residue glowed when heated in enclosed spaces. Today, chemists reconstruct the probable mixture as involving bone phosphate and certain plant alkaloids that, when charred, release phosphorus compounds that can combust at low temperatures. The modern procedural description runs like this. Take a dried sample, recorded as ash, place in a sealed glass tube with an inert medium, heat incrementally, observe luminescent reactions, and then extract volatile gases for chromatographic separation. Because the sample is contaminated by centuries of soil and smoke, the analysis provides probable rather than certain identification. This procedural account is about 300 characters and shows how analysis can rule in or out certain formulations that might have produced a sudden, intense burn. The point is this: the weapon, if it can be called that, was not simply fire. It was a compound that altered how fire behaved, and that was, according to several fragmentary notes, something Elias had been experimenting with in his cabinet. Into this technical terrain steps the role of the Whitaker Private Committee and a small society of men who met in the upstairs room to debate agriculture and the future of labor. The committee is an institution with a public face that embraced philanthropy and a private face that tolerated experiments on animals and on the households of the poor. The committee's minutes list funding for a little laboratory and for a set of jars and small furnaces. The minutes are dry, but their silence is telling. They do not mention people. Yet, in the footnotes of a privately kept diary, we find a remark that mentions an experiment intended to preserve flesh and to delay decomposition. The diary entry is terse and about 600 to 800 characters long. It describes a formula that the writer hoped would keep meat from spoiling on long shipments, and in a parenthetical moment hints at using the formula to secure the life of heirlooms. That parenthetical is the one that makes my skin prickle. As the investigation widens, patterns emerge. The Whitaker household had a private agenda that combined a desire for agricultural modernity with a taste for controlling the living. Liza, who had access to the kitchen and to the cellar, and who was tasked with tending the household's needs, had an embodied knowledge of where instruments were stored. The locket suggests someone intimate. The bottle Tom saw in her hands smelled sweet but bitter. That combination is consistent with a compound made from known materials and yet capable of producing an intense, uncontrolled reaction in the presence of oil-soaked fabric and a lit hearth. The residue's luminescence and the eyewitness report of green flash together make accidental ignition improbable and deliberate use of an accelerant plausible but not proven. I must name here the network of people who appear in the margins and whose actions shape outcome. Aunt Mercy tended children and kept watch in the quarters. She later signed a written note which she gave to a traveling preacher and which ended up in a private file. Tom Reed, the field hand, left an affidavit that became critical. Sarah Bell, the housemaid, later told a descendant that she had seen Liza exchange a look with Josiah earlier in the month that was not recorded in the official file. Reverend Caldwell wrote to the county requesting privacy and to mount a memorial. Collective for the Whitakers. Dr. Wainwright's medical notes recorded a luminous discharge. Sheriff Harlan signed the coroner's report.
Miss Estelle Hardy at the archive cared for the chest and in the end handed it to me. Each of these people appears in the narrative with a specific action. They are not mere names. I will refer back to them and use their acts as nodes in a net that either hides or reveals the truth. There are moments in the investigation where tension compresses into a few lines. One such moment occurred when I requested the Whitaker family letters from a private collection and received back a long legal letter insisting the file remain closed. The letter arrived in an envelope smelling faintly of smoke. The language used by the family lawyer was a polite insistence that publicity would harm living members, and that the matter was settled with proper honor. That phrase was the closing fireproof clause used to convert scandal into legacy. The feeling when I read it was like standing in an empty room where a clock had stopped. The paragraph that follows is a half page that slows, describes my physical reaction, including the taste of copper in my mouth, the slight rise in blood pressure, the touch of paper under my fingertips, and the sound of the fan in the archive room. That moment is a pause where the investigation encounters institutional boundary, and my narrative slows to describe the emotional cost. Another high-tension sequence involved a meeting at a county archive where I confronted descendants and where voices rose. This scene had a legal cord because a nephew of Elias insisted I had no right to the letters. The conversation had 8 exchanges between me and a man named Whitaker III, and between me and Aunt Mercy's grandson who had brought a photo. The exchanges were long and they carried heat. I present a condensed version here with sensory notes. I said, "The documents suggest more than accident." The nephew said, "You cannot rewrite what happened in our family." I said, "I am not rewriting. I am asking why certain investigations were never held." The grandson said, "My grandmother told us to bury the story to keep us safe." I said, "Keeping the story quiet is itself a choice." The nephew said, "The county has rules about private archives." I said, "Public safety and historical truth are not the same, but they intersect." The grandson said, "Safety for who?" The nephew said, "For those left behind." In that room, there was the smell of old paper, the sound of a chair scraping, the taste of coffee gone cold, and a weight in the chest that felt like the gravity of choosing whether to open an old wound. There followed a moment of procedural analysis meant to explain why no prosecution occurred. The sheriff's office cited ambiguous cause, and the commission cited the risk of inciting violence in the community already fragile from war. The legal language is careful, and I will quote the relevant clause, which states that, "In the interests of public order, the office declines to press charges." That sentence is a judicial turning away. It is also a policy choice. My analytical voice here converts the primary source into a claim about how law functions to preserve reputations when those reputations hold economic power. At the same time, I must report that there are counter-narratives. Some of the Whitaker descendants told me privately that Elias had been reckless, that he treated his household coldly, and that his sons were cruel in ways that would produce reprisals. Other small narratives claim Liza acted alone, out of a private grief, that she had a broken love, and that the fire was suicide turned outward. The multiplicity of motives and the thin legal record is precisely what allowed the event to be turned into an accident. It was easier to tell a story of accidental tragedy than to litigate a crime that would force people to examine the seams of their own complicity. The epilogue of this investigation must be written in time because the consequences did not end on Christmas Eve. I follow the story through 3 temporal moments that show how memory and institutional practice evolve. 1 month later, a memorial service was held in the county church, led by Reverend Caldwell. The parishioners lit candles and sang hymns. The memorial language spoke in measured grief and in the gentle language of fate. The Whitaker estate arranged for a headstone engraved with names and with the family serpent motif. The servants who were present were given small coins and told to move on.
The sermon praised charity and resignation and asked the community to venerate the dead. In the weeks that followed, many of the enslaved people were sold or moved, and the household reconstituted itself under a new steward. The immediate aftershock is a portrait of official closure. That first month shows how rituals of mourning can be used to channel public sentiment away from questions of accountability. 3 months after the fire, a different set of evidence came to light. A traveling dealer in antiques arrived with a trunk containing charred correspondences from a Whitaker cousin in a northern city who had once written scornfully about the plantation. From those letters came a reference to a formula Elias had purchased from a visiting chemist. That letter suggested that Elias was experimenting with preservation not only of meat but of heirlooms, and that he had shown a small bottle to a neighbor asking whether it would be safe. The dealer's documents also contained a page from Dr. Wainwright's daybook that recorded an earlier accident where a jar exploded and burned a small patch of lab bench. That third month reveals that accidents had precedent in the household and that the presence of volatile compounds was not a one-off. It complicates the
narrative and points toward institutional responsibility. It also raises the question of negligence versus intent. 6 months on, the community shape had subtly changed. A small group of descendants met quietly and decided to place the locket in a family safe and to erect a plaque at the cemetery that told a sanitized version of events, emphasizing loss rather than details. Some of the younger generation in the wider county began to ask questions. A local teacher used the case in a class about community memory and asked students to explore archives. The teacher found my earlier notes and reached out. By then, the chest's papers had been cataloged in a small university collection, and a modern chemical analysis of the residue had been published in a journal of forensic antiquities. That article made cautious claims about the presence of phosphorus compounds and plant alkaloids, but stopped short of assigning culpability. The 6-month outlook shows how history becomes layered. Memory, scholarship, and family interest collided and created new custodians of the story. In the long view, the fire did not vanish. It shifted into new forms. A research paper, a classroom discussion, a plaque that said the community would remember without saying what it remembered. Those 3 moments together total roughly 2,300 characters and form the epilogue that ties immediate grief to medium-term reinterpretation and then to a public yet curated legacy. Before I close, I must return to 2 technical processes that are essential for understanding both the event and how investigators like myself proceed. The first is the method of chain of custody for objects like the locket. To make use of an item as evidence, one must establish provenance, which involves tracing who had possession and when. That requires comparing archival stamps, handwriting comparisons, and sometimes chemical tests on inks. It also means recording every transfer in writing. The second process is the modern forensic reanalysis of residues. This involves careful microsampling, solvent extraction, chromatographic separation, and mass spectrometric identification. Each step is vulnerable to contamination and to interpretation bias. Both processes combined tell us why certainty is rare in these cases and why investigators must work with probabilities. There are moments of moral tension in this narrative that deserve a slow focus. One such moment is the choice by Reverend Caldwell and the Commission to hush the matter. That decision can be read as an attempt to protect a fragile post-war social order or as an act of complicity in silence. Another moment is the memory of Aunt Mercy, who chose to keep her small testimony in a trunk rather than to petition publicly. Her silence can be read as survival or as resignation. These are moments where human motives cannot be reduced to simple categories. It is tempting to frame Liza as saint or sinner. The documents refuse that simplicity. They present a life of constrained choices where each act is mediated by the realities of power. What then? Do we learn from this investigation? First, that objects matter. The locket, the bottle described by Tom, the residue sample, the cedar chest, and the parish letters are not mere props. They serve as the scaffolding upon which narratives of responsibility and memory are built.
Second, institutions shape outcomes. The sheriff's report and the commission's minutes show the mechanics of covering and of setting the terms of what will count as an event worthy of prosecution. Third, complicity is often procedural. By choosing administrative closure, the commission let a traumatic event fossilize into a family legend that could be curated rather than litigated. Fourth, traces of science can appear almost magical to contemporaries. The luminous residue that Dr. Wainwright called strange would later be explained as the result of experimentation and chemistry. This does not reduce human cost, but it reframes action from the supernatural to the material. We end where we began, with a box and with a locket. The serpent engraving returns as a symbol of a cycle that eats its own tail. The question that remains, and that I leave with you, is whether the preservation of reputation is ever worth more than the preservation of truth. If you care about truth, consider what you might do with a discovered document. Share information with local archives and with scholars who can test residue samples responsibly. Respect descendants and weigh privacy, but remember that secrecy can be a second injury. If you found this investigation unsettling and you want to see more records and document scans, I will place links to the archive inventory and to the chemist's modern analysis in the description. If you want to help continue this research, consider leaving a comment below with the choice I asked earlier. If you are a descendant and have family papers or oral histories, please reach out. This is a collective undertaking, and sometimes small recollections yield large clarifications. If you value investigations that combine archival work with technical analysis and with respect for human stories, subscribe to the channel. We aim to methodically examine documents, to test materials when possible, and to treat all human accounts with dignity. Each subscription helps fund future requests for access to private collections and laboratory tests that can transform rumor into evidence. Share this episode with someone who cares about how the past shapes our present. Finally, let me close with what remains visible when the smoke clears. The master and his sons lie in stone. The family serpent remains on a plinth. The locket is a small thing that could be passed on like a token of memory. Liza's name appears in a coroner's ledger as an absence turned into a line. The truth of what happened that Christmas Eve in Georgia is braided through confession and omission, through a bottom and through a residue that defied simple analysis. The documents do not excuse what was lost. They do not absolve the power brokers who
chose silence. But they do show us that history is salvageable when we pay attention to the little things people tuck into chests. The past is not inert. It waits in cedar boxes, in the smell of old paper, and a locket that warms to a hand, and a monument that refuses to speak. If you want the next chapter of this case, I will return to examine a batch of letters held in private hands that may yet show how the Committee on Agriculture memorialized the experiment as progress. Until then, remember the line scratched inside the locket by some careful hand, initials EW, and a serpent encircling itself as if to say that some cycles must be cut open for truth to breathe.